Manhattan traffic was chaotic as always. Ethan Carter drummed his fingers on the steering wheel of his Aston Martin, impatient with the sluggish yellow cabs blocking the street. He was about to turn onto Fifth Avenue when, in the middle of the crowd, something caught his attention. A girl. She was crossing the street in a hurry, clutching a stack of books to her chest. She wore faded jeans, a simple blue sweater, and worn-out sneakers, completely oblivious to the noise around her. Her brown hair fell loosely, a few strands blowing in the wind as she frowned, seemingly focused on something, or perhaps lost in thought. She didn't glance at the luxury cars, didn't stop to admire the high-end storefronts. She just walked, determined, as if nothing but her own world mattered. Ethan was intrigued. He was used to being noticed. Women usually cast curious glances. Some even discreetly took pictures when he passed by. But this girl, she had no idea who he was. When the light turned green, the car behind him honked impatiently. Ethan hesitated for a second before accelerating, but his eyes followed the young woman until she turned a corner and disappeared from sight. Damn. He needed to find out who she was. Ethan's apartment sat atop one of Manhattan's most exclusive buildings, offering a spectacular view of Central Park. But that night, neither the skyline nor the lively party in his living room held his attention. With a glass of whiskey in hand, he absently scrolled through his phone, while the loud music and laughter of his guests filled the air. "What's up with you? You look distracted," asked Oliver, his childhood friend and usual party companion. Ethan spun the glass in his fingers. "I saw a girl today." Oliver raised an eyebrow. "And since when is that news? You see girls all the time." "Not like this one." "Ah, I see, you want a challenge." Ethan chuckled but didn't answer. Was that it? Maybe. But there was something different about her. She seemed real. Like she wasn't trying to fit in, impress anyone, or be noticed. He had to see her again. And when Ethan Carter wanted something, he got it. The next morning was cold, the New York sky covered by a veil of gray clouds. Ethan Carter, however, didn't care about the weather. He had a clear goal: find that girl. He spent the morning making calls, pulling some strings here and there. Money made things easier, and soon he had her name, Sophie Brooks, 22 years old, a literature student at NYU. A completely ordinary girl, with no connections to the elite circles Ethan frequented. And that only made her more intriguing. After a few more inquiries, Ethan found out that she often spent her afternoons at a small, quiet cafe, not far from campus. He didn't hesitate. A few hours later, a sleek black Aston Martin parked in front of the cafe. Ethan stepped out of the car with his usual confidence, wearing a casual suit and a watch worth more than the rent of the entire block. As he walked in, heads turned, but not Sophie's. She was sitting alone at a table by the window, completely absorbed in a book. Ethan ordered a coffee, not really caring about the drink. Then, looking around, he made an impulsive decision. "I'll pay for everyone here. Whatever they order." A murmur of surprise spread through the cafe. A few people smiled, some thanked him, and one girl in the back even took out her phone to record the moment. But Sophie? She just turned the page of her book. Ethan felt a flicker of irritation. He walked over to her table, resting a hand casually on the chair across from her. "Hope your next cup is on me." Sophie lifted her gaze. For the first time she looked directly at him. Her expression wasn't impressed, just mildly curious, like she was studying an exhibit at a museum. "That was nice of you, but you didn't have to do that." She closed her book without hurry. "I like doing good deeds," Ethan replied with a confident smile. Sophie nodded, picked up her coffee, and took a sip. "Good to know." And just like that she returned to her reading. Ethan stood there for a few seconds, uncertain of what to do. He had expected a glance of admiration, a smile, maybe even an invitation to sit down. But Sophie just went back to her book, as if he was nothing more than background noise. He left the cafe feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: frustration. Ethan Carter had never needed to try hard to win someone over. His presence alone was enough to open doors, draw smiles, and spark interest. But Sophie Brooks? She had walked away from every attempt as if he were invisible. And that only made it more interesting. If buying coffee for an entire cafe didn't impress her, then he would raise the stakes. The problem wasn't him, it was the setting. Maybe she just needed a different environment, something more exclusive. That's when the idea of the charity gala came up. On Friday night, the ballroom at the Plaza Hotel was filled with impeccably dressed people, holding champagne glasses and chatting about investments, art, and philanthropy like it was a game. Soft music played in the background, expensive perfume lingered in the air, and everything was set up just as Ethan had planned. He had made sure Sophie was invited. A generous donation to NYU secured a few student tickets for the event, including hers. Now, all he had to do was wait. And then she appeared. Unlike the women circulating the room in shimmering designer dresses, Sophie wore something simple. A plain black dress, no flashy details or extravagance. But that was precisely what made her stand out. Her eyes scanned the room with slight skepticism, as if she wasn't entirely convinced she should be there. Ethan smiled. He waited for the right moment to approach, choosing an instant when she was alone near the drinks table. "Never thought I'd see you at an event like this." He kept his tone casual. Sophie raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised to see him. "Yeah, well, I got an invite. The university handed out a few tickets. Lucky you," she tilted her head slightly. "Or lucky you," Ethan chuckled, picking up a glass of champagne. "Maybe both." For a moment, he thought things were going well. But before he could steer the conversation toward something deeper, a group of older businessmen approached, eager to shake his hand. Investors, CEOs, people who knew his last name and wanted to maintain good relations. Sophie watched with an amused smile as the men praised Ethan's ventures and casually mentioned their private jet trips to Monaco. By the time they left, Ethan turned back to Sophie, ready to pick up where they left off. "Sorry about that. They are used to talking about money all the time." Sophie finished for him, her tone light but sharp. Ethan hesitated. "Well, it's their world. And yours too." It wasn't a question. Before he could respond, Sophie swirled the wine in her glass and glanced around. "You know, events like this always make me wonder. How many people here actually care about philanthropy, and how many just want an excuse to show off their wealth?" Ethan opened his mouth but stopped. He didn't have an immediate answer. "Anyway, it was interesting, but I think I'll head out." "Already?" Sophie gave him a small, knowing smile. "I've seen enough." She walked toward the exit without looking back. Ethan remained still, holding his untouched champagne glass. He had just realized something groundbreaking. This time, money wasn't enough. Ethan Carter wasn't used to failure. But for the third time, Sophie Brooks had walked away completely unimpressed by his efforts. Showing off wealth didn't work. Luxury didn't work. So what did? The answer came as he replayed the night of the charity gala in his head. Sophie had been in her element when discussing deeper topics. Literature, inequality, the true purpose of philanthropy. She didn't care about his money. She cared about ideas. If Sophie liked intellectuals, then he would become one. On Monday morning, Ethan walked into one of New York's biggest bookstores and bought everything. Philosophy, classic literature, politics, history. Some titles he recognized, others looked like they were written in a foreign language. But it didn't matter. He was going to absorb knowledge, shape himself into the kind of man Sophie respected. That week, his schedule became chaotic. Between meetings and social events, he spent hours watching lectures on YouTube about existentialism, memorizing quotes from Nietzsche and Marx, and trying to understand what the hell James Joyce was even saying. But the real test would come on Saturday. He found her at the New York Public Library, sitting alone at one of the large wooden tables, surrounded by books. The scene looked straight out of a movie. Ethan adjusted his cashmere sweater. Yes, he had swapped his suits for a more intellectual look, and grabbed one of the books he had bought. The title? Crime and Punishment, because it sounded impressive enough. Taking a deep breath, he walked over. "Dostoevsky is a genius, don't you think?" he said, casually placing the book on the table and sitting across from her without waiting for an invitation. Sophie looked up slowly, a flicker of surprise or suspicion in her eyes. "You like Dostoevsky?" Ethan smiled confidently. "Of course. The way he explores human nature, the conflict between morality and instinct, fascinating." Sophie narrowed her eyes. "What's your favorite part?" Ethan froze. Favorite part? Shit, he hadn't gotten that far in the book. "Ah, well, it's hard to choose, right? But that scene," he pretended to flip through the book, stalling for time. Raskolnikov faces his own reflection. Silence. Sophie crossed her arms. "That doesn't happen in the book." Ethan felt his stomach drop. Sophie bit her lip, clearly holding back laughter. You didn't read it, did you? Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but Sophie simply gathered her books and stood up, getting ready to leave. Hey, wait. He stood up too, desperate to recover. I was just trying to impress you. Sophie looked at him for a moment. And why not just be yourself? Ethan had no answer. She gave him a small smile before walking away. Ethan remained standing there, holding a book he had never read. He needed a new plan. And fast. Ethan Carter was not a quitter. If the I'm a millionaire approach didn't work and the I'm an intellectual strategy had failed spectacularly, then he would have to try something even bolder. So he secretly enrolled in a university seminar at NYU. With a generous donation to the school, he secured a spot as a guest student in a modern literature course, where Sophie would be. The plan? To demonstrate real intelligence this time, to show that he wasn't just some rich guy trying to impress her. The problem? He had no idea what he was doing. On Tuesday afternoon, Ethan walked into the lecture hall, holding a book in one hand and wearing a rehearsed look of confidence. The room was spacious, with about 30 students scattered across the seats. Sophie was there, sitting in the middle, writing in her notebook without noticing him. Perfect. He chose a seat slightly behind her, close enough to observe, far enough to think of a way to impress her. The professor entered and began his lecture on postmodern literature. Ethan nodded along as if he understood every word, pretending he had already read all the books mentioned. Then disaster struck. Mr. Carter? The professor called out. Ethan blinked. Yes? How would you interpret the role of alienation in Pynchon's work? Silence. Sophie slightly turned her head, curious to hear his answer. Ethan forced a confident smile. Pynchon. Pynchon? Who the hell was Pynchon? He cleared his throat, stalling for time. Well, I'd say alienation is fundamental. The professor raised an eyebrow. In what sense? Ethan felt sweat forming at his temple. In the alienating sense. Silence. Then, a few scattered chuckles. Sophie bit her lip, trying not to laugh. The professor folded his arms. Fascinating. Any other interpretation? Perhaps one that isn't redundant? A student raised her hand and gave a perfect, well-structured answer. Meanwhile, Ethan sank lower in his seat, wishing he could disappear. When the class ended, he waited for Sophie outside and caught up with her in the hallway. Okay, go ahead. Laugh. He sighed. Sophie gave him a small smirk. I already did. Ethan looked at her, embarrassed. I just wanted to impress you. Sophie tilted her head slightly. And why not just be yourself? Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but for the first time he had nothing to say. She smiled softly before walking away, leaving him standing there, completely speechless for the first time in his life. Ethan Carter had never felt this way before, the feeling of not being enough. He had tried to win her over with wealth, and she didn't care. He had tried with knowledge and failed miserably. Now every time he saw Sophie Brooks, he felt a strange weight in his chest, a mix of frustration and something he didn't want to admit. He genuinely liked her. And that was a problem, because he had no idea how to just be himself. In the following days, Ethan disappeared. No more buying coffee for strangers, no more showing up at the library, no more sneaking into NYU lectures. He threw himself into work at the family company, attended corporate events, and returned to his usual social circle. But somehow, everything felt emptier. The parties felt dull. The women around him felt uninspiring. And, for the first time, he wondered if he was happy or just used to being surrounded by people. Sophie noticed his absence. She didn't want to admit it, but after weeks of Ethan showing up in the most unlikely places with his ridiculous schemes to impress her, she had gotten used to his presence. And now? Nothing. She caught a glimpse of him in a TV interview about a gala event, surrounded by investors and models. He looked like the same Ethan as always. Perfect suit, perfect smile, but something seemed off. She didn't understand. Why did this bother her? Maybe he wasn't as superficial as she thought. Or maybe she was just fooling herself. Sophie shook her head, pushing the thought away. Ethan Carter was just another self-absorbed millionaire. Right? But then, why did she miss him? The night was cold, and a light rain draped New York in a melancholic glow. The streets were nearly empty, streetlights casting shaky reflections in puddles, and Sophie Brooks walked briskly home, clutching her coat tightly against the wind. That's when she saw him, sitting alone on a park bench, no luxury car, No impeccable suit, no usual air of confidence. Ethan Carter looked lost. His gaze was fixed on the ground, hands clasped together, hair messy from the humidity. There was something broken about him, something Sophie had never seen before. She hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. "Ethan?" He slowly lifted his head as if he hadn't even noticed the rain until that moment. When he saw her, he let out a quiet, humorless chuckle. "Of course, you'd show up now." Sophie frowned. "What are you doing here?" He shrugged. "Trying to figure out who the hell I am without everything else." She narrowed her eyes. "And what did you find out?" Ethan ran a hand over his face, exhausted. "That I have no idea." Sophie sat beside him, unbothered by the cold bench beneath her. "Why do you always try to be something you're not?" He was silent for a long time before finally answering. "Because I never knew if just me would be enough." Sophie held her breath. For the first time, she was seeing the real Ethan Carter. No masks, no games, no strategies. Just a guy who for once looked as lost as anyone else. She let out a soft sigh. "Maybe if you stopped trying to impress everyone, you'd realize you already are." Ethan turned his face to her, his eyes reflecting the dim glow of the nearest street lamp. For a moment, there were no words, just a silence charged with something new. Something real. And for the first time, Sophie didn't want to walk away. The rain kept falling, light and steady, creating a soft sound as it touched the leaves of the trees around them. Sophie and Ethan were still sitting on the park bench, now with no rush, no expectations, no games, just the two of them. "Have you always been like this?" Sophie asked, hugging her arms to keep warm. "Like what?" Ethan looked at her. "Always trying to be someone you're not." He let out a quiet, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "Ever since I can remember. My father built an empire from nothing, and he expects me to carry it forward. And I'm good at it. I know how to play the game, I know what to say, I know how to be what people expect me to be." Sophie tilted her head slightly. "But you don't know who you really are." Ethan exhaled slowly, looking straight ahead. "No." She was silent for a moment before asking, "And what do you want?" He turned to look at her, really looking. And for the first time, he didn't think about what the best answer would be. He didn't try to be someone she would admire. He was just honest. "I want to find out." Sophie didn't say anything right away, just studied him as if she was seeing beyond the image he had always sold to the world. "You never needed all of that, you know?" Ethan frowned. "All of what?" "The cars, the money, the events, the memorized quotes from philosophers you never actually read." She smirked. "If you had been like this from the start, things would have been a lot easier." He let out a soft chuckle. "I screwed everything up, didn't I?" "You did. But maybe there's still time to fix it." Something inside Ethan unraveled. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to prove anything. For the first time, someone saw him. And that night, under the light rain of New York, Ethan Carter didn't try to impress Sophie Brooks. He just stayed. And for the first time, that was enough. The sun was slowly rising over New York, painting the buildings in golden hues. The morning was cold, but Ethan Carter didn't feel it. He walked alongside Sophie Brooks, unhurried, with no destination in mind. Just the two of them. No luxury cars, no expensive suits, no elaborate plans. Just him. After that night in the park, something changed. Ethan stopped showing up trying to be someone else. He didn't buy books he wouldn't read, didn't memorize quotes to impress, didn't create over-the-top situations to get her attention. Instead, he simply started to be there. Sometimes he would run into Sophie at the cafe and strike up a conversation about ordinary things, without trying to sound impressive. Other times they'd bump into each other at the library and talk about what they genuinely liked to read. And this time, he admitted when he didn't know something, and Sophie would laugh and help him pick a good book. Ethan Carter was no longer trying to win Sophie Brooks, and maybe that was exactly why, at last, she started to truly see him. Now, walking side by side, Sophie glanced at him with a small smile. "So what happened to the Ethan Carter who always had the perfect answer?" He chuckled, shoving his hands into his pockets. "I think he finally realized he never had any." Sophie nodded, satisfied. "Good. I like this Ethan better." Ethan turned to look at her, watching the way her eyes gleamed under the soft morning sunlight. And for the first time, he didn't feel the need to say something impressive. He just smiled. They kept walking together. No luxury, no pretense, no rush, just them, exactly as they were. And for the first time, that was enough. The first kiss happened without warning. One random night, after another long conversation at the cafe. Sophie stood up to leave, and Ethan, without thinking, grabbed her hand. She looked at him, surprised, and before either of them could rationalize it, it happened. It was intense. Unlike anything Ethan had ever experienced, and he had experienced a lot. It wasn't a calculated kiss, it wasn't a rehearsed move. It was raw, overwhelming, a jolt of electricity rushing through his entire body, an uncontrollable desire he hadn't even realized he had been holding back. Sophie kissed him back with the same intensity, as if, despite resisting, despite denying it, she had known all along that this would happen. And that when it did, it would be devastating. From that moment on, everything became feverish. Their conversations, once casual, were now charged with an undeniable undercurrent. Their glances lingered longer than necessary. Small touches, a brush of fingers, a hand resting on a waist, felt like igniting a fire. And then came the nights. Ethan had never known a desire like this. He had been with beautiful women, women who knew the game of seduction, but Sophie didn't play. She felt, and she made him feel too. Every touch, every kiss, every time their bodies came together with nothing between them, it was as if the entire world disappeared. As if New York, money, and expectations no longer existed. Only them, consumed by each other. He wanted her desperately, possessively, uncontrollably. And Sophie wanted him the same way. One late night, after a long silence in the dark, Ethan turned to Sophie and whispered, "I've never wanted anyone like this." She traced her fingers slowly over his face, following the line of his jaw, his lips, as if trying to memorize every detail. "I know." He took her hand and placed it over his chest where his heart was pounding. "This is yours." Sophie closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. Then, with a soft smile, she whispered back, "I accept." At that moment, Ethan knew he would never be the same again.
What did you think of the story? Did Ethan truly deserve to win over Sophie? Do you think they stay together? Leave your comments and please subscribe to the channel.